Hello, students. This is part one of a series of topics that we're going to be talking about in U.S. history class. This covers the 1920s and 1930s. I'm going to talk to you about a variety of things in this three-part series. The first part I'm going to talk about are the writers, musicians, artists of the 1920s and 30s, as well as the Harlem Renaissance, which is a rebirth in African American culture, the Jazz Age. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about a bevy of things. I'm also going to talk to you about the Great Migration. So this is going to be a lot of information. And in the second and third parts are going to be more of a continuation of the 1920s and 30s people, the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance. And the third part is going to be about the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal. So there's a lot of stuff I'm going to talk to you about. This first page is the category of music. Two important Americans to know here are Aaron Copland and George Gershwin, who were very important composers who wrote uniquely American music. And a composer is somebody who writes music and performs. George Gershwin, you've probably heard his orchestra and songs in Tom and Jerry and Fantasia. It goes like this. Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, I'm going to play it for you in class. So George Gershwin was a child of immigrants. He was a Jewish immigrant. His parents immigrated from Poland. And his famous works were Porgy and Bess, which was a play, Rhapsody in Blue, which goes dun 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 dun. You've heard Rhapsody in Blue and Fantasia and Tom and Jerry, so you've heard that before. And Summertime, and he died really young. Aaron Copland, another important composer. He composed the Tenderland and Appalachian Spring, and I'm gonna play this music for you in class. Very important composers. This is a writer of the 1920s and 30s. He died pretty young as well. His name was F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he was descendant to Francis Scott Key, who wrote our national anthem. So he was related to him. He was in the area of literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a novelist. You know what a novel is? It's fiction. Novels are fiction stories. He wrote about the jazz age of the 1920s, and he coined the term jazz age. So he came up with the word jazz age. People playing in big bands, playing with saxophones, trumpets, drums, trombones. So he wrote about that time period, ragtime, which is my favorite decade. 1920s is my favorite decade. So he wrote about that. Another writer of this time period was John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck was a novelist who portrayed the strength of poor migrant workers during the 1930s. And that's during the Great Migration. He wrote about Okies in Missouri who lived in the Ozarks, and they traveled west to California to find better opportunities, to find gold, to find better jobs and a better livelihood. And he portrayed the strength of migrant workers in his books called Of Mice and Men, which is one of my favorite. My favorite character, Lenny, who was mentally challenged, and he had a lot of problems, and he traveled from farm to farm with his cousin. And other books by John Steinbeck was The Grapes of Wrath, which talks about a family leaving the Midwest and going to California during the 1930s. During the Great Depression in the East of Eden. So John Steinbeck, important writer and novelist. An artist during this time period, female artist, is Georgia O'Keeffe. And she was born in Virginia, and I think she was raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. And she was in the area of art. Georgia O'Keeffe was an artist known for urban scenes, which are scenes from a city, neighborhood block, skyscrapers. and later paintings of the Southwest. And I think she moved to the Southwest, I think after her husband died or with her husband. And here's a picture of a skeleton head of a Texas Longhorn with a trumpet rose flower. You've seen these paintings before. Scenes from states like New Mexico, I think she traveled there, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and parts of Nevada. So scenes from the Southwest. Here's some other paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe. Here's a skyscraper in New York City. And here's another painting of fruit, apples. And she was known for painting pictures with fruit and flowers that were very up close, very, very excessive, very up close, and very visual for you to see. Because she paid attention to detail, and she wanted people to pay attention to detail when people viewed her art. This slide right here talks about an overview of Prohibition and the Great Migration, and I'm going to read through these notes. Prohibition, we learned about that before, is when the 18th Amendment outlawed the buying, sale, drinking, and manufacturing of alcoholic beverages. It was also known as the temperance movement, which was led by religious leaders at the time. Prohibition was imposed by a constitutional amendment. It made it illegal to manufacture, transport, and sell alcoholic beverages. It was the 18th Amendment. There are some results that happened because of Prohibition. Speakeasies were created, which were illegal bars. You had bootleggers who made and smuggled alcohol illegally and promoted organized crime. And you had the repeal by the 21st Amendment, because the government could not enforce and prevent people from drinking alcohol. You had organized crime. I don't have it mentioned on this slide. People like Al Capone, which were criminals who created alcohol and sold it. So this is basically a review of Prohibition and what that was about. The Great Migration, North and West. The Great Migration was a time period between 1900 to like 1950. Some factors about the Great Migration period. Some push factors. Push is something that's negative, and pull is something that's positive. So some push factors for African Americans to leave the South, to go north, Midwest, and West, was the fact that jobs for African Americans in the South were scarce and low paying. That's because of discrimination, racism. Second push factor was that African Americans faced discrimination and violence in the South. You had the Ku Klux Klan that was rampant during this time period. A pull factor is that African Americans moved to cities in the North, in the Midwest, in search of better employment opportunities. However, African Americans face discrimination and violence in the North and Midwest. There were riots in cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Lansing and Detroit. Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a riot that killed hundreds and thousands of African Americans. It's not mentioned a lot in history books, but I wanted to point that out. A lot of wealthy and middle-class African American neighborhoods were targeted by hate groups and racist people who feared that African Americans were going to compete for their jobs and take them. So there was a lot of racism and discrimination and turmoil. I'm going to ask you to answer these questions on the right-hand side. You can answer these somewhere in your notebook on a sheet of paper, and you have to present them to me. You're also going to do Edpuzzle questions as well. Question number 1 says, what was Prohibition and how effective was it? 2, why did African Americans migrate to northern cities? What are some push and pull factors? 3, what were the economic changes during the early 20th century? 4, the repeal of what constitutional amendment ended Prohibition? 5, if African Americans migrated north into the Midwest, in what cities did they most likely settle? That's not in the notes, and that's based on prior knowledge. And I basically talked about it. Basically talked about it earlier in other classes, and earlier in this presentation, and will in other parts of the presentation. 6, what were illegal drinking clubs during Prohibition called? I left a question mark right there, sorry. So take time to attend to this assignment. Here's some pictures that reflect Prohibition. U.S. has voted dry. 36th state ratifies dry amendment January 16th. And notice the date, it says January 16th, 1919. And that's after World War I. And that was a big moment and big experiment that failed miserably. And over here is a picture of a speakeasy. And this industry was outlawed. The industry of alcohol and beer was outlawed by the 18th Amendment. Here's a picture down here during Prohibition of law enforcement officers overseeing the pouring of beer down the sewer. Couldn't do that. And this right here, this primary resource document called the Daily Mirror, says Prohibition ends at last, ended in 1933. So during the Great Depression is when the 21st Amendment replaced the 18th Amendment. This section talks about the Great Migration in detail. Here's a picture of a family. I think they're from Florida, an African-American family who's packed up all their belongings to go up north. Remember, some push factors that made African-Americans leave the South was racism, racial violence, segregation, discrimination, and low-paying jobs. And there's a good book called The Warmth of Other Suns, really interesting book about the experience of African Americans leaving the South, going up north, the cities like Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., also out west to L.A., San Francisco, Seattle, Denver. They also went up to places in Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. A lot of my ancestors went up to Michigan to work in Detroit in the automobile industry, particularly my dad's side of the family. So they're going up north to trying to find a better beginning, and oftentimes they still face racism and discrimination in the north. Here's a bar graph that shows the time period between 1860, which was before the Civil War, to 1930, and the key represents the black and the key represents the percentage of African Americans living in the North, and the gray represents the percentage of African Americans living in the South. So still, if you were to say in general, most African Americans still lived in the South, but over time they migrated north for better opportunities and better paying jobs, becoming teachers and doctors and lawyers, and factory workers where they can get paid better, like in the steel mill, textile industry, mining industries, clothing industries. So they wanted things to be better for them and their children. And here's a map of the Great Migration from 1916 and 1930. And you have to do a couple exercises. It says, list some states African Americans would leave from to go north and Midwest during the Great Migration. So you need to pull out an atlas or use the map in the classroom to help you with this assignment if you don't remember the states from memory. And the second question asks, list some cities on this map that African Americans migrated to during the Great Migration. If you can't see this map, once again, use an atlas in your book or use prior knowledge. And I want to emphasize the word city because a city was the place where you had a lot of industries, a lot of specialized industries, meat packing, coal mining, textile, steel, making furniture, making household supplies, automobiles. So that's a wrap for part 1. Please do the exercises and thank you for listening. Peace.